So with the addition of a rules FAQ released by one of Games Workshop's official tournaments, it can now be argued that Warhammer 40k basically has 3 or 4 different ways to play the movement phase. Let's talk about the change that event has had to rule on and why. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the curious case of Warhammer 40k's movement phase once more, to see Games Workshop's next hint at a move to patch the issues that they created with the whole pivot thing. When the balanced data slate came out, it was kind of obvious that the 40k movement rules that they'd come out with did need work. For some reason, Games Workshop in their wisdom decided to make the change halfway through the edition to basically change the standard ways in which models move around the battlefield, and do so in a fairly impactful way, going from the slightly more free form of making sure that no one part of the model moves more than a certain amount of inches, to going into a bit more of a defined and clear route for the whole idea of doing translations and pivots moves. The idea is that you move your vehicle or monster around the board, generally measuring from the center point to the center point, and then if you pay the pivot value that model might have, you can freely rotate it on its axis at any point, but if you don't, then you can't, and it has to stay in sort of locked orientation. I must admit I do quite like the idea of it. It's just maybe a little bit more obvious what happens with the movement, rather than occasionally having things like not being quite so clear. That is actually maybe, say, the back corner of a vehicle that might be moving the furthest if you're going around a bit of terrain or something. But the way it was implemented maybe just didn't really take account for certain models, and the problems with it meant that tournaments and events generally had to bolt on house rules in one way or another to try and stop people gaming extra movement. We're still waiting on any sort of official errata from Warhammer community about it, which I suspect will come at some stage. But basically the proposed patch that was announced a few days ago came via one of Games Workshop's own tournaments, and perhaps is one of the very most legitimate and central events as ways to look at for how Games Workshop intends to play 40k with input from their own rules team. It's still not an official patch, but it seems like it's pretty workable until they do so, and does seem to iron out at least one of the issue, if adding even more layers of rules that you can or can't use. Just to briefly run through the main issues with the whole pivot so we can get on to why the change matters. I'd say there were a few issues with the system that they brought in. The first one, which I thought was perhaps the weirdest idea, was that they decided to have 2 slightly different systems for movement, one for general 40k and then one that makes changes to that for tournament play. I've really got no idea why they thought that that was a good idea. It's not like you have changes to the core game between the way that units shoot in regular 40k and then somehow it's different in a tournament. I could see there needing to be a few maybe basic mission changes that might not be appropriate from tournament play to narrative play, for example, but core movement of the game really doesn't seem to be something that they should subdivide like that. The looser way that they ruled it outside of tournament missions basically allows a lot of units with oval bases to gain a little bit more movement. Otherwise there was still an issue with the tournament pack though, basically things with round bases but measured to the whole, with things like Doomsday Ark or Raiders being good examples. They could gain significant movement, perhaps particularly shorter charges from Deep Strike, paying no pivot value when they turned around. I'm not sure it was entirely game breaking, and most of the units that could take advantage of it weren't really things that you wanted charging out of Deep Strike or anything anyway, but it just felt like their new movement rules kind of breaking their standard Deep Strike rules, which seemed really strange. For the non-tournament pack missions, you don't pay any sort of pivot value for oval bases that aren't monsters or vehicles, so say things like Custodius Virtus Praetors or the Triumph of St. Catherine. They can both have free pivots and gain a bit of movement that's a bit less than an inch. It's not enormous, but it could be an 8-inch versus a 9-inch charge out of reserve, a crucial extra inch if you're trying to charge something on the board. I'd say the reserve thing is usually the most impactful thing, as an 8-inch charge with a reroll is like around about 2/3 chance to complete, rather than a bit less than a half for the 9-inch one. Clearly not the way that Games Workshop was intending people to use pivot in my opinion, and feels maybe a bit try-hard for a casual game, but I'm just not sure why Games Workshop left it in. The difference between the core pivot rule and the tournament pivot rule is a change basically to the second bullet point of the rule. In tournament play, literally anything that isn't on a round base must pay the 2-inch pivot value, including say things like bikers, or I think the Chaos Warpsmith has a slightly oval base if I remember right. If they want to turn around and they have to pay a big 2 inches, which occasionally could be a big downside, so it means that often in more tournament games you might weirdly want things like bikes and cavalry to go sort of drifting around terrain, so you might have them weirdly moving at oblique angles if they want every inch of their movement value. That's different to the base rule set, as that one is just monsters and vehicle models that aren't on round bases have to pivot, so that allows you to do the movement with the oval bases. There was one class of units that basically slipped through the gaps for both of these rule sets though, and that's things like Doomsday Arks or Drukhari Raiders, big long things that still had a round base with the flight stem, but for most measurements on these things you measure to the hull and not to the base. Even in the tournament pack, it meant that the Doomsday Ark could basically pivot just completely for free, and that means that you could gain around about 2 inches of movement or so. Not always the most important thing in the world, but occasionally it could be kind of crucial for getting line of sight, and again, at least in theory land, for very short deep strike charges, which while most of these aren't that great for doing that, it still felt weird. Officially that's still going to be the way that it works until they do any sort of core rules errata to the Pariah Nexus tournament pack or the core rule for pivot, and they probably should have thought of this class of things when they wrote the rule. As mentioned, it can matter for deep strike, but can be really big for things that just want to get as far forward as possible, Drukhari Raiders being quite a good example of that. They might want to move really far forward, drop off a squad, and then have that squad charged with a stratagem. By both the core and the tournament rule set, they can deploy at the very edge of their deployment zone and put themselves side on. Then they can use that free pivot to basically turn around completely for free, gaining around about 2 inches or so from that big spur on the front, and then you can go off with its very good movement characteristic, drop a squad and charge, and genuinely with charge rolls, an extra 2 inches onto the charge could be a massive difference, maybe allowing them to hit a squad that's even further back in the backfield. Again, just doesn't really feel rules as intended in any way to me, and probably something they should have considered in advance. This part of the rule is the bit that the tournament errata tries to address. This one comes from Games Workshop's Tacoma Open Grand Tournament, the big one that's going to be going on in Washington over the weekend. These US Open series of tournaments are Games Workshop's flagship events, run by themselves and intended to demonstrate Warhammer 40k being played at the highest level. So compared with other tournaments around the world, including really big ones, they maybe just do have a bit more of an air of legitimacy about them, and perhaps not too surprising that people look to them as an example for rules intent from GW themselves. Earlier in the week, they basically issued an FAQ and sent it out to the participants, basically trying to patch out the issue of these vehicles with the flight stems and things. Vehicle models that are on a round base that's greater than 32mm in size with a flight stem or hover stand have a pivot value of 2 inches in this. And this one basically fixes the issue for things like Raiders and Doomsday Arks and other things like monoliths that could potentially charge out of reserve in Necron Hypercrypts that could be used to get easier charges with the rules. Seems sensible enough, though it maybe hits a few of the things that weren't quite as much of a problem. Kind of weird that units like Crisis Suits would technically trigger that if you assemble them with the flight stems, but they wouldn't if they don't. I wouldn't say that they're quite as big of a problem though realistically, given that they don't have an enormous base overhang like some of the rest. As you measure from the bases as well, it's not like they shorten move distances. For the legitimacy of this one, they said that this answer was formulated with the Warhammer 40k Rule Studio. It's technically just official for this event only, though any other tournaments that want to may use it, but currently it's not considered to be formal game-wide errata until delivered by Warhammer community. Kind of interesting on that one, because if they say that it's coming from the words of the 40k Rule Studio, we can probably expect some sort of update like this in the future as the fix for that rule. But I guess Games Workshop don't want any individual event basically determining the errata for the entire game. That one's got to come centrally. So we can't consider it to be 100% official for every game in 40k, unless individual players choose to play with it. I feel like what's crazy about this one though is that now we basically have 4 different movement systems for Warhammer 40k 10th edition. Out of this list, technically only 2 and 3 are technically official ones, though I feel like we'll probably get people playing with literally everyone out of the spectrum. There's certainly greater or lesser numbers for some of them. Given the way that the rules are printed in the book, I'm sure plenty of people will just continue going with the game launch version if you don't play in big events and have a relatively tight-knit gaming group that doesn't tend to play with outside players that much. You might just choose to never bother to use the pivot rules whatsoever. Stick with the way that it had before, particularly as most people generally tended to consider it working kind of fine. Technically that rule is removed from the game though if you go by the most up-to-date version of 40k. Then we've got the general 40k pivot rules that don't abide by the tournament thing. In that one you can still both abuse the oval bases and the flight stem vehicles if you want to. Use them to gain a bit of extra movement or shorter charges from deep strike if you really want to. Then you can opt to play with the tournament companion pivot rules if you think that's a better fix. That fixes the general oval base abuse for things that aren't monsters and vehicles. Though even this one isn't really kind of legitimate for every single 40k game out there. In theory it's just supposed to be for organised play events. So at least from Games Workshop's internal point of view, this one's sort of aimed at people who are actually playing at tournament events or are playing practice games with the intent to. Then finally we have this fourth tournament pivot rules plus the Games Workshop suggested fix for Tacoma Open, which comes from the Rules Studio but is completely unofficial. That one to stop the abuse from round-based flight stem vehicles as well. I'm sure plenty of people will be happy to adopt that and play with it, though given that it's so unofficial, I don't even know where you download the document to see that yet. It's not very easy to have rules that you might be trying to play with in-game and you can't even reference. It certainly implies that Games Workshop might well use that to patch it in the future though who knows, the Rules Studio might come up with a different fix in the meantime. Overall though, I just feel like this is rather too many versions of the same movement system, and realistically there should have been just one original one and then what they changed it to, and not have 3 different versions of the thing that they changed it to. This does certainly imply that there will be another errata at some stage though, when this sort of fix for the tournament pack gets turned into official errata, and Games Workshop wind up doing some errata for their errata document. No idea when that'll actually take effect. I guess they might have some sort of minor update as a bug fix for the Pariah Nexus launch, or it might just wait until maybe the next 3 months or so until the next balance pass, when they might release some more digital content en masse. Overall, just feels like a really strange situation. I'm not really saying that it's going to be super impactful to people's games or anything like that. I feel like it's just one of the things that perhaps you could just mention to the opponent at the start of the game to check that you're on the same page about things. Wouldn't really take up that amount of time. I'm sure local game groups would decide the way that they're going to do things, whether it's following the Tacoma ruling or just playing the standard way as determined by the core rules. For me, I think the fix is a pretty reasonable one. I think my first preference would be to play via the Tacoma ruling until they come out with something official. I think I'd go for that one if the other player was up with it. Otherwise, probably just go for one of the current ones, either the one out of the core book or the tournament companion. But I certainly wouldn't look to try and abuse in-game movement on the oval bases and round skimmer bases myself. Overall, bit of a silly situation. I really don't mind the change to the pivot rules, but just feels like there's too much complexity for this, which should be a really simple phase of the game. Hopefully they can just really decide on what they're doing. Hopefully fix the patch so everything is the same whether you're playing in tournaments or the core game, and then everyone else can just get on with doing things the way that they're allowed now. In any case, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Do you think that the fix is a good one? And which way have you been playing Pivot? Is it via the core rules or the tournament pack ones in your games of Pariah Nexus so far? In any case, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to stay up to date with Games Workshop's news, rumours and rules changes that they do. I do tend to post at least one new video every day. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's links down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.